God. Great. Welcome all to session DS2, party time. I'll be your chair today. And today we have 3 panelists giving papers: Christopher Thomas, Jiangnan Xiang, and Vicki Tromanhauser. As I mentioned before, we will be giving these papers in turn. We'll take a 2-minute pause after each paper so that everybody can sort of collect themselves and before the next paper, and then we'll take another pause before the Q&A. So without further ado, I'm bringing you a first panelist, Christopher Thomas, giving a paper today called Risking Illness for the Sake of Pleasure, Post-Pandemic Party Giving in Mrs. Dalloway. Christopher Thomas is originally from Oxford, England. He received his BA from the University of Bristol and an MA in Modernist Literature and Culture from King's College London. At KCL, he developed his final thesis under Professor Anna Snaith around the unsettling onset of photographic vision, examining the crisis and representation explored by Woolf in her collection of short stories, Monday or Tuesday. He joined the University of Maine in 2020 as a teaching assistant and graduate student specializing in poetry and poetics in the Department of English, where he has just completed a manuscript of poetry. Great.
Hi, thank you, Shilo. I'm so excited to be here. First of all, I'm just going to put a copy of the script into the chat for anyone who wants to read and follow along. It's a PDF and hopefully that downloads quite easily. And I do have some slides too. Can everyone see that okay? Perfect. So today I am here to talk about risking illness for the sake of pleasure. I'm going to go straight into it. On or about March 2020, human character changed. It was on March 23rd that Britain's Prime Minister delivered a speech containing the following command. From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home. This instruction prompted an indefinite wave of apprehension, which was of course not just confined to just the British people, but played out in its own way in every country on earth. Within months, thinkers and commentators had begun to take account of the unprecedented disruption to human life caused by the COVID-19 virus and its consequent lockdowns. In July 2020, the philosopher Javi Carrel wrote, quote, "There have been profound changes to our freedom of movement, sense of time, and the sense of trust and certainty in the world." Claiming that our embodied existence had been modified by the pandemic, Carrel's phenomenological examination of the collective physical response to the pandemic serves to remind us just how, quote, "deeply embodied and inherently social life is," arguing that the distancing measures still in place for some parts of the world have, quote, "caused disruption on a scale not known to most of those currently alive." One novel seemed especially relevant to these new experiences of isolation, to these new practices of not being with others, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. Evan Kinley wrote in The New Yorker, quote, "In the first days of the stay-in-place orders made necessary by the coronavirus pandemic, anxious variations of one of the most famous openings in English literature began cropping up on Twitter." The opening in question, of course, was Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself, which Kinley says is, quote, "oddly fitting for parodying in the midst of this particular crisis because it captures the significance of simply going out to do something quite quotidian, which before our pandemic would have been taken for granted." Kinley goes on to write, "At a time when our most ordinary acts, shopping, taking a walk, have come to seem momentous, a matter of life or death, Clarissa's vision of everyday shopping as a high-stakes adventure resonates in a peculiar way. We are all Mrs. Dalloway now." Another commentator, Jess Cotton, described that Woolf's, quote, "famous opening line has taken on new resonance this year as the pandemic has made all our worlds much smaller. Clarissa wants to buy the flowers herself because she's delighted to go out, as we might appreciate, having spent so long indoors." It is an easily overlooked aspect for many readers of the novel that Clarissa has, quote, "spent so long indoors before setting out to buy the flowers for herself, although just how much time is unclear. Clarissa seems to have undergone a personal doctor-ordered lockdown prior to the novel's opening. By the time of the novel's 1923 setting, fears about influenza and its continuing outbreaks persisted from the famed 1918 to 1919 pandemic. In 1922, for example, the British Medical Journal had published a report entitled Influenza, suspecting that, quote, in predicting the immediate future, the sudden change of the weather last week must be taken into account, and on the whole, it is probable that the first week of 1922 will provide a considerable increase of recorded deaths from influenza. But, it states, with the events of 1918 to 1919 fresh in our memories, we should be foolish not to see the elements of the problem which are disquieting. Indeed, before much else happens in the novel, Woolf establishes a moment of bodily suspense in relation to Clarissa's virus-damaged heart as she moves through London's Victoria Street, pausing us, her readers, to consider, quote, her heart affected, they said, by influenza. As Jennifer Spitzer has observed recently, quite sharply, influenza here is parenthetical. Like the death of Mrs. Ramsay, it is a major event signaled in a minor aside. Since her illness, we read later of Clarissa, she had turned almost white. And beginning on this particular morning, in June of 1923, on which was the pressure of all other mornings, we are offered a glimpse of the delicate pink face of the woman who was that very night to give a party, suggesting that taking the initial plunge of going outdoors is singularly momentous for Clarissa Dalloway. There are many forms of sickness represented in Mrs. Dalloway and by a variety of characters, whose stories are less obvious than, say, Septimid Smith. Peter Fifield, writing in the year or so before our own pandemic, observes in his book, Modernism and Physical Illness, Sick Books, that Septimus's shell-shock condition has understandably taken precedence in discussions of illness around the novel, and he suggests that it might even be, quote, the foremost instance of illness in Woolf's oeuvre. Fifield's own critical position is centered on the, quote, drama of visibility and invisibility, by which Woolf depicts sickness in the novel, specifically influenza via Clarissa. Fifield claims that influenza's presence is, quote, woven as a pale but perceptible thread throughout Mrs. Dalloway, thus conjuring illness as a paradoxical spectacle of inscrutability. Indeed, Fifield notes that Clarissa's illness has passed before the novel even begins. Fifield's account perhaps neglects the lasting reprogramming that can happen in a post-pandemic life. Clarissa has in fact undergone a profound change that has altered her sense of experience fundamentally, especially since her illness, Woolf writes. Clarissa frequently experiences within her a brutal monster working against all pleasure in beauty, in friendship, in being well. Clarissa muses on this new brutal monster as a kind of hatred, as she at one point calls her impatience with the foibles of others, Miss Doris Kilman in particular. Woolf's own life and perspective was fundamentally forged and in many ways defined by illness. Physical illness for Woolf was at least partly mystical, as she would write on the 16th of February 1930, after having been consigned to lie on the sofa for a week, owing apparently to influenza. Once or twice I have felt that odd whir of wings in the head, which comes when I am ill so often. Last year, for example, at this time, I lay in bed constructing a room of one's own. If I could stay in bed another fortnight, but there is no chance of that, I believe I should see the whole of the waves. I believe these illnesses are, in my case, how shall I express it, partly mystical. Here, illness stands in for an opportunity for exciting impressions and flights of imagination. Yet at other points, illness left Woolf on the brink of a death-like limbo. For instance, on the 18th of February, 1922, Woolf writes about an overwhelming feeling of creative dormancy resulting from 6 weeks of influenza, claiming, I am suspended between life and death in an unfamiliar way. As her diaries and letters make clear, Woolf was burdened constantly with physical sickness and ailments, and not only through her own experience of a particular disease, but also through gossip, storytelling, or caregiving for others. If we turn to her letters, we find Woolf seems to even gain some subversive joy in knowing about illnesses. Woolf wrote an especially demonstrative letter to the novelist Hugh Walpole on the 10th of February 1929, in which she asks, what is diabetes like? I could write reams upon the effects of the nervous system, on the nervous system of influenza. Another person's disease would be great fun, and another person's mind. The fact that Woolf claims she could write reams upon the effects of influenza is indicative of just how often she was plagued by the disease. Her curiosity in this letter for what Walpole's diabetes is like is synonymous, it seems, with curiosity for knowing something distinct about his mind. The great fun of knowing an illness from another perspective suggests that for Woolf, illness does not simply shut down the possibilities of knowing others, but might allow us to understand them more fully as a subject, in some measure owing to its ability to generate sympathy. Elizabeth Outker's recent Viral Modernism, also released just before the COVID-19 pandemic, describes how Woolf was plagued with influenza in the years surrounding the pandemic of 1918 to 19, contracting several strains before and after its peak, including a deadly version late in 1919. Indeed, Woolf's health deteriorated consistently over the years, likely as a result of exposure to these strains of influenza, to the point that by 1922, a heart disease specialist predicted she would not live long. Outker and others have turned to Woolf's On Being Ill to understand her perspective on illness and the possibilities of its literary representation. Yet to understand the specifically ethical and even philosophical dimension of Woolf's thinking on illness and the fundamentally human experience of being with others, I turn to the 1924 essay that she wrote for the Times Literary Supplement, a review of the essays of the 16th century philosopher Michel de Montaigne. Notably, Woolf's diaries reveal her quite literally flitting between Montaigne and the manuscript which would become Mrs. Dalloway, descriptions of which are replete with thoughts about her own health at the time. On the 12th of January 1924, for instance, Woolf writes, "According to Montaigne, one is various. I can't lay down a law for my own feelings. My health is as good as it will be in this world, and a great deal better than it ever has been." On the 23rd of January, she records, "Now I'm sending off Montaigne and back again tomorrow to the Hours, which I was looking at disconsolately." It would seem that writing Montaigne at least enlivens Woolf's attitude to working on her novel, and perhaps even brings her inspiration. That Woolf says her health is as good as it would be in this world is surprising, because on the 3rd of February, a few days after the essay is published, Woolf writes, "Owing to influenza, I don't think I've seen more than a handful of people, was congratulated on Montaigne by Logan." Though there is little critical attention on the relation between Montaigne and Woolf's fiction, it strikingly foreshadows the famous dictum that it's very dangerous to live even one day, playing that danger against the absolute centrality in life of interhuman communication. Montaigne seems less concerned with actually assessing the philosopher's essays than it is with articulating a theoretical model of health, one that gestures to communality, spontaneity, and the municipal properties of pleasure. Above all else, Woolf pronounces, "Pleasure has no relish unless we share it. As for the risks," she continues, "that we may catch cold or get headache, it is always worthwhile to risk a little illness for the sake of pleasure." Such a comment seems immediately significant for and applicable directly to Clarissa, who we learn is repeatedly considered foolish for, quote, liking excitement when she knew it was bad for her heart. Indeed, Woolf describes in Montaigne a set of beliefs that sound highly like those that Clarissa tries to articulate as her justification for throwing the party. In Montaigne, Woolf writes, "To communicate is our chief business, society and friendship our chief delights." For Clarissa, this becomes, quote, taking the trouble to give a party for no reason whatsoever, synonymous with this thing she called life, thus embodying none other than Woolf's notion by Montaigne that society and friendship are, or should be, one's chief delight. Moreover, the business of communicating to others almost becomes in the novel an explicit metaphor for health and well-being, one that is more agreeable than and directly opposed to Dr. William Bradshaw's rather masculine notion of ill health, founded on not having a sense of proportion. Markedly, Woolf writes in that essay, "Communication's health, communication's truth, communication is happiness. To share is our duty, to go down boldly and bring to light those hidden thoughts which are most diseased, to conceal nothing, to pretend nothing, if we love our friends, to let them know it." These sentiments are charged with an urgent and liberating call for the possibility of sharing as a duty, for keeping nothing concealed from one another, for disclosing our fondnesses, and for, note Woolf's word use, bringing to light those thoughts which are most diseased. Woolf's own sense of well-being and health in the Montaigne essay is ostensibly tied to a reaction against a medical establishment represented by a character like Dr. Bradshaw. It is predicated upon seeking pleasure and is as an embrace of everything, including oneself. She writes in another part of the essay, "If we do what we like, we always do what is good for us. Doctors and wise men may object, but let us leave doctors and wise men to their own dismal philosophy." She talks about wine and the seasons, but I won't read the whole thing in the interest of time. At the pinnacle of Clarissa's party, as she escorts the Prime Minister down the room in front of the other guests, for example, we receive the subtle suggestion of the risk that Clarissa takes for that intoxication of the moment, as she experiences a dilation of the nerves of the heart itself till it seemed to quiver, steeped upright, a stark reminder of the aftermath of her influenza. This moment dramatically evokes Woolf's comments in Montaigne that if we do what we like, we always do what's good for us. While time does not allow me to explore the many details of Dalloway that become activated by this attention to a post-lockdown experience and the philosophy espoused in the Montaigne essay, I will note one particularly interesting character. Ellie Henderson, Clarissa's cousin, is a complementary representation of the Woolfian risking of illness for the sake of pleasure. We catch a glimpse of Ellie sitting alone at the party, wondering if Clarissa had meant to invite her at all, given that her invitation, quote, had come at the last moment. At the party, Ellie sits by an open window, which we learn of in Woolfian parentheses, contemplating how earlier she had ran out and bought cheap pink flowers and then threw a shawl over her black dress. It was an event to her going to a party. It was quite a treat just to see the lovely clothes. And yet Ellie muses on the possibility of getting ill, of catching some form of sickness by the open window for the sake of pleasure in this particular space. Was it drafty? Ellie Henderson worried. She was subject to chills. But it did not matter that she should come down sneezing tomorrow. It was the girls with their naked shoulders she thought of, and her chills never went to her chest, never. Ellie represents, I think, a particular sort of concern in 1923, a heightened awareness of the prospect of getting sick in a post-pandemic world in a space where pleasure is being shared. Her self-consciously narrated susceptibility to and nervousness about illness, she was subject to chills, but it did not matter, acts as an interesting mirror for Clarissa, since Woolf presents this clearly, albeit brief snapshot of anxiety surrounding embodiment endangered or compromised by illness to signal something about Clarissa's own party giving. When Richard Dalloway comes over to keep the poor creature company, for example, Ellie can't say more to him as small talk beyond the fact that many people really felt the heat more than the cold, but what more did one say? In many ways, and like all literature, Dalloway is transformed by the conditions of its reception, by the lived conditions of its readers. After the staggering loss of the pandemic, the loss now of so many lives, but also the profound global disruption that has altered all lives, we now read Dalloway with a new recognition of its ethics of sympathy and togetherness. The real joy of Woolf's proclamation in Montaigne is felt anew for us, now that we have some basis for sympathy with the experience of both Woolf and Clarissa. To communicate is our chief business, society and friendship our chief delights. The same is true now for Clarissa's own proclamation of why she throws a party when she knew it was bad for her heart. What she liked was simply life. That's what I do it for, she said, speaking aloud to others. The party was, as the name of the novel famously puts it, an offering. And it was an offering to combine, to create, to understand ourselves through close, sympathetic proximity to others. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Christopher, for that wonderful paper. Found myself very moved, actually, by your bringing sympathy and proximity and post-pandemic sort of illness and Mrs. Dalloway together. So let's take 2 minutes and we'll come back at 25 after the hour to hear our next paper. Okay. Give everybody a moment to come back. Awesome. And then we'll get started again. Our next just a second. Our next panelist, Jiangnan Xiang, is presenting a paper called Go Beyond the Expectations of a Hostess Toward the Concept of Hospitality today. Jiangnan Xiang is a graduate student in sociology at the University of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in China. Previously, she received an MA from the University of Chicago in sociology and the other MA from China University of Political Science and Law and Jurisprudence. She has been providing legal aid on domestic violence cases. Currently, she is interested in gender studies and the sociology of law. She's excited to listen to the upcoming interesting topics and wishes to bring in some interdisciplinary ideas. I'm very happy to have you and excited to listen to your paper this morning.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah. I'm Jiangnan, and frankly, I'm not the expert at wolf. I think that my first story with wolf is that in my middle school, our school need us to quote 6 beautiful sentences from the book every day. So I brought wolves to the lighthouse, and I just randomly pick one page and collect words and hand in my homework. So I think that she's very helpful. And right now I'm also working on my project about Hostess, and I think maybe I can ask Wolf for help again. So I wrote this essay. So go back to my topic today. So I'm talking about go beyond the expectation of Hostess towards a concept of hospitality. So my outline would be that my presentation consists of 3 parts. The first is what is hospitality, and second is a hostess and her role at the party, and the third one is a hostess go beyond the role. So what is hospitality? It's a hospitality occupied an essential place in various culture and religion, involving the fundamental concept like care, reciprocity, like the forgiveness or embodiment, blah, blah, blah. And some anthropologists thought that the hospitality could be the concept that replaced the concept of gift. The gift is the idea that Morse said in his famous book. And this kind of the ideas is really evaluate the context and examine the identity through the amendment relation. So we can see clearly that the hospitality is about the host and guest relation. For example, in the talk, I'm the host and you are the guest. I want to give as much as I can to show that I'm a good and I'm generous. So it's about I should give more than receive something. But in the rational economic individual, that everyone is working for their benefit. So this kind of the difference between these two models. And because we know that the hospitality or the others kind of the philosophy started with the patriarchal tradition, then some scholar might say that we could came up with some feminist hospitality, but it found it fell into some kind of the essentialism, because they think that the feminist hospitality would be kind of the mothering, the kind of the selfless, which is only an imagination of the woman. And then some scholar might think that maybe that there is never there is a hostess in the history. The hostess is only an extension of the host. Emotionally, I cannot agree with that idea. So I want to find if there's really some hostess that I can investigate. I think when we talk about the hostess, even we cannot see them in the academia, we can recall some figure in our mind. For example, in the French salon, we can see the hostess talk about the political issue, and maybe they can influence the broader environment. And maybe you can see in a rural village, when a woman, she's calculating how many hands in her family and how many how much food she can serve for the dinner. They both of them are hostess. So I think they are more hostess than we have already seen. And this time I pick up the two hostesses in Woolf's novels. The one is Mr. Ramsay and the second is Mr. Dalloway. And both of them are the hostess. I choose them to hostess at the party because in the party, the things become more clear and the rules, they are formalized in the party. So we can see that what is hostess do at the party and what they are expected and what they do accord to their expectation or they go beyond their expectation. So so here the expectation on the hostess. I draw the circle here. They said we should make the slide more attractive, so I draw small pictures. The gray one is the hostess and the black one is the guest. So I collect from this two book and I found maybe there are three characters that a characteristic that the hostess show there. The first is show charm. We all know that the Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa and Mrs. Ramsay are beautiful. Although people might not like them, they appreciate their charm at the party. When Clarissa escorted her prime minister, she was prancing, sparkling with the stateliness of her gray hair. And so did Mr. Ramsay. And when she stepped down the floor, she accepts what they could not say. They attribute her beauty. So they are really beautiful from at the first glance, right? And also we can see that their beauty is not only sexual attraction, because we can recall that both parties, they got two young, beautiful ladies at the party. The one is Mr. Ramsay's, Miss Dalloway's daughter, and the other is the Mintai. I'm not sure if I spoke correctly. They got a golden reddish face, and they really amuse the guest. And we also can recall that the guests have a different feeling toward them. And Peter said he was not in love with Clarissa, and William Banks said once they feel nothing for Mr. Ramsay, or they feel that they got the feeling that's more than this kind of the sexual feelings. And maybe we can say that the idyllic beauty of the Mr. Ramsay is an archetype of nature where the sexual feelings sound childish. And maybe the hostess' charm was more from the symbol of eternal family that aroused a mixed feeling of the male guest. And then we can see the second, I think maybe the most important function here is that for the hostess is to entertain the guest. We can see the first one, the showing charm, that the host is only, it's a one way. She just circle and she just express her charm. And the second one is a two-way interaction. She needs to, although that's the hostess is this kind of rules that she needs to observe or listen to or care for every guest. It seems that like the greetings, the talk, and the catering, the food, they are formalized rules. But to practice them, she really needs to put some substantial care for them. She should know the style or the character of the guest, what they like, what they dislike. For example, I remember that in the Clarissa's party, the Clarissa noticed that the quarrel between the two men about kind of about what, and she just she feels she must include the quarrel between the Professor Burley and Jim Houghton at a distance, and she wisely solved the quarrel, said she loved Bach and had men set off. So she really have to entertain them while you're paying attention to them. The hostess cared for each guest to make them feel at ease and try to act invisibly. They were capable of entertaining a huge amount of guests at the party, and they are more than reliable. For the third part, the host need to bring the guests together. We know that both of the novel, the word was where scientific, religious, and heroic faith had been smashed. I think not only at that time, I think right now we are all experiencing this kind of word that people need to reunite together or blah, blah, blah. And so this special function of them, they need to bring the guests together. So it like and also we know that the party is a ritual, is full of symbol. The host need to work on the symbol and to continue the party and let the guests makes the guests feel that they are a union, they are united together. We can recall that Mr. Ramsay, she have the children light the candle, and they really feel that they are in a place which is away from the daily life. And both and in the party time, that no more talks, they are for the realistic benefits. The hostess could shape the force for the gathering through several specific ritual, because the hostess was a collection of the desire and the other who are willing to respond with hospitality. The guest can express any emotion he wants without hesitation. And in the process, the guest might feel himself ruled by a higher moral force and make him feel that he's beyond the limits of his individual physical body and times. Maybe someone will feel that he seems to have become a new being. So at that time, also the hostess who become like a personified god, like the goddess, she had to create a sacred time for her guest. So we can see that in the third picture, it's about the great one to become the bigger, and she include all the guests. But then at the time, she might feel that even she's at the center, but she is still an outsider. The hostess then she feels fulfill the expectation we have discussed above, but she is also aware of that the function she needs to the function people have on her or expectation on her, it seemed a paradox. But she also needs to work hard to fulfill it. Also, she might feel that even she served them, she cared for them, she's not a member of them. For example, Mr. Ramsay, when she talked about the English diary system with warmth and eloquence, she only received her children and her husband's love. And Clarissa, she also, when she asked two gentlemen, what are you talking about? And she answered before they, she said before they answered, and she said, they won't tell us about what they said. So they know clearly that they are not a member of like the other guests. When they utilize their talent and beauty, she sensed that she got kind of the achievement. But she knew that their achievement also confined to the party. The role of hostess in mediating the public and private space and controlling social interaction between hostess and male guests in a broader environment is limited. So this so this is kind of the expectation they reach and they cannot reach. But when we say that they are kind of the passive object, can we have this kind of moral idea about hostess? Can they really have developed their some things from their own experience and their own voice? I think my answer is yes. I think maybe we can go beyond the expectation, because they are really actor in the party. They are not only the actor in the performances, but they are actor who acting to repair and maintain the party to going smoothly. And just as we mentioned before, the hospitalities will concentrate more on the relation rather than the individual identity. So maybe we could see from the maintain relations here. And we can see that Mr. Ramsay, she concluded that the sterility of man, although she know that she might be treated equally with them. She provide limited attention as maintain the gesture of the welcoming and greeting and sheltering and nourishing her guest. And when she acknowledging the presence of the other guest through her welcoming smile, she had her own experience of entertaining the guest. And so we can see that even they are kind of a passive person to entertain their guests during the party, they still have their own ideas how to do them. And this repeated things really really consist some experience. And this maybe we can go from this three part like some they can reach maybe one in the complicated context is that the host really should go to the pay attention to every small talks in the party to see whether the party were going on, which is different from, we know that right now we always use the kind of principle to do some abstract things, thinking. And also we can see that when the hostess, she cared for every guest, she put everyone as an end without just care them as a, and also care them as a whole. And this could also be a new direction in thinking about the hospitality from the woman's experience. I think that's this three ways might be a great direction for thinking more about the hospitality. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jiangnan. My brain is starting to buzz with sort of, I really like this idea about thinking about the hostess as the moral subject, and the various little diagrams that you showed were so helpful in thinking about conceptualizing this relationship. So I'm really excited to talk about this in the Q&A as well. So thank you so much for your paper. All right, we're going to take about 2 more minutes, and then we'll come back for Vicki Tromanhauser's paper. So it is about 9:42 here. So let's come back. We'll say actually at quarter of, we'll do 9:45, so quarter of the hour, and I'll see you all in a few. Jiangnan, you can stop sharing your screen, I think. Oh, no, you did. Never mind. I just have you as the speaker view, I think. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. All right, let's get started again. Our next speaker, I'll let everybody come back for a moment. And we'll get into our last paper of the panel before the Q&A as we hear from Vicki Tromanhauser. And today we're going to hear a paper about meat decadence, Lady Bruton's Luncheon, and the ethics of appetite. Vicki Tromanhauser is Associate Professor and Chair of English at the State University of New York at New Paltz. Her articles have appeared in the Journal of Modern Literature, 20th Century Literature, Wolf Studies Annual, and the Miscellany, as well as in various essay collections, including Handbook to the Bloomsbury Group, Literature and Meat since 1900, and Teaching Modernist Women's Writing in English in the MLA Options for Teaching series. She received the Andrew J. Capel Prize in Literary Criticism for 2012, and she serves on the editorial board of 20th Century Literature and on the PMLA Advisory Committee. She is interested in animal studies, disability, and food, and is currently working on a book titled Modernist Meat, which explores changing configurations of flesh in the early 20th century British women's writing. While she's sorry to share only a Lilliputian-sized version of herself this year, she looks forward to seeing you all life-sized at next year's Wolf Conference in Florida. This gives me great pleasure to bring you Vicki Tromanhauser.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I don't have a PowerPoint or anything, so it'll just be my small little speaking box. All right, we're all perhaps a little compromised by our desires, and Mrs. Dalloway's unflinching portraits of the frustrated ambitions of women like Lady Bruton and Doris Kilman gain poignancy from the carnal appetites they expose. Whether Lady Bruton's desire to wield Britannia's scepter by throwing an exquisite lunch party, or Miss Kilman's desire to avenge herself of nationalist and class prejudice in the form of a pink cake that tastes of Elizabeth, such scenes provide an occasion for thinking often uneasily about ethics and pleasure together. I read these two scenes of culinary extravagance in light of recent scholarly efforts by Vincent Sherry, Alex Murray, and others to reclaim decadence as a mode central to modernist aesthetics and an unappreciated source of its progressive energies. We can hear the decadent undertow of the novel in the elegiac cast of Richard's ruminations as he passes the memorial to Queen Victoria outside Buckingham Palace and thinks, "It was a great age in which to have lived." What impels Richard in this moment to seize the day, to summon the courage to present Clarissa with flowers and declare his long unspoken love for her, is a growing apprehension of time winding down, not only for himself, no longer in the prime of life, but for an entire cultural historical era he senses is now crescent. Reflecting on a full stomach, since he has just been richly fed at Lady Bruton's, Richard's sense of the greatness of the age has a hefty dollop of the counterfactual. In a kind of inventory of privilege that includes Clarissa's choice to marry him over Peter Walsh, he muses, "Really, it was a miracle, thinking of the war and thousands of poor chaps with all their lives before them, shoveled together, already half forgotten. It was a miracle." The syntax of his thought stream and its half forgetting works its own burial of the tragedy of the First World War that it cannot entirely expunge. The war's carnage, those heaps of corpses by the thousands, in its distant and disingenuous pathos as poor chaps. The melancholy thoughts about those chaps thus stirred in his internal reverie become shoveled together as indistinctly and unceremoniously as the war dead in unmarked graves at the front, grammatically interred in the buckling syntax of Woolf's sentence between Richard's repeated reflection that it was a miracle, as though repetition alone might grant its simple optimism a performative power. But the downward pull of thousands of the war dead drags his chipper celebration of life's bounty tombward, along with the future promise of a younger generation all their lives before them, that the war so catastrophically canceled. A similar nostalgic reflex to evoke the great war dead, only to banish them from conscience, animates Lady Bruton's Luncheon and her scheme for emigrating young people of both sexes born of respectable parents and setting them up with a fair prospect of doing well in Canada. In the dense narrative layering of Lady Bruton's indulgent multi-course lunch, we taste the posthumous flavors of the decadent sensibility that informs Woolf's representation of post-war London culture and its commemorative impulses. As Jessica Martell points out, the refrain of Lady Bruton's Lunch, how it is not paid for, echoes one of the persistent fictions of the post-war period and its failure to acknowledge the war's heavy material costs and to deliver proper restitution to its victims, combatant and non-combatant alike. That the table spreads itself voluntarily offers a searing exposure of another prominent Great War myth, of the willing recruit who, ardent for some desperate glory, signed up for mass slaughter. The distinctly undomestic setting of this masculine lunch party, attended by a soundless entourage of servants who wait upon the guests like government functionaries, or aproned, white-capped like Red Cross nurses, queasily nudges the atmosphere of the boardroom table of war profiteers toward the surgical table of a field hospital. Admitting to having lured her guests under false pretenses, Lady Bruton trades upon the war's carnage as she invites her guests to tuck into casseroles of severed chickens and turbot sunk in films of brown cream that conjure the maimed and broken bodies of the Western Front. With the memory of wartime rationing and its privations still fresh, the lunch's savory extravagance with its anthropophagic undertones deposits us in the muddy corpsescape of the battlefield. Its creamy brown colors evocative at once of the khaki camouflage of British Tommies like Septimus, and the sepia-toned footage of combat that granted civilian audiences a vicarious experience of its horrors. The wartime chromatics extends to the saucers of red fruit and the red carnations that lay beside Lady Bruton's plate like fallen soldiers, recalling Septimus's self-imagining as a partially buried corpse, macerated to the nerve fibers and spread like a veil upon a rock, while the iconic red flowers of Flanders grow through his chest. All of the narrator's deft symbolic substitutions here gesture toward the embarrassed rhetorical reflections that formed official responses to the mounting casualties of the war. Lady Bruton's most appreciative and corpulent guest, Hugh Whitbread, is invited out of expediency, the occasion on which he had been remarkably kind, remaining unnamed and unremembered by his hostess. And where the others have occasion to meditate gloomily on the trouble in India or the ineptitude of English colonial administration implied in Peter Walsh's failed career, Hugh thought only of his chicken. The novel's savaging of Hugh's character by Peter Walsh and Millie Brush, who thinks him one of the greediest men she'd ever known, draws special energy and animus from George Duckworth, whose fondling and incestuous nighttime embraces undermines that fossil of Victorian respectability with his admiring circle of Mayfair dowagers. Afloat on the cream of English society for 55 years, Hugh is the same age as Woolf's stepbrother in 1923, as Christine Fraulo has noted. And his leisurely pace with the casserole gives the others ample time to notice his expanding girth. Lady Bruton must patiently allow Hugh to enjoy his souffle before he provides the rhetorical puffery for the letter to the Times. How, therefore, we are of the opinion that the times are ripe, the superfluous youth of our ever-increasing population, what we owe to the dead. Richard recognizes that Lady Bruton's emigration scheme, like the hollow rhetoric employed to champion, is all stuffing and bunkum. But from the root of Lady Bruton's Mayfair dining room, manages to persuade himself, there's no harm in it, of course, his reflexive qualification betraying a momentary ethical wobble. The lunch's exquisite meaty decadence is whipped up at no small expense to garner support for an essentially eugenical project, to emigrate the nation's superfluous youth to Canada, a scheme of sublimated sacrifice hatched in the exhausted twilight of the conservative government. For Richard is already preparing the history he aims to write of Lady Bruton's distinguished ancestry for the advent of the Labour Party's ascent to power. But subject perhaps to some truancy of the logical faculty, Lady Bruton's plan merely outsources the problems of Britain's post-war inflation and employment shortages to the colonies, and trades on the same false promise of the Great War itself, which so readily translated the future of its youth into an extravagant, exponential waste of life piling upon life. The aging dowager, who did not go deeply into things, is content to sink replete and heavy-lidded into ethical torpor, her post-lunch nap intimating a historical era and set of values that has outlived its natural term. This decadent mood or sensibility I'm tracing in the novel extends equally, if less expectedly, to the tea and pastries Elizabeth enjoys or endures with her German tutor Doris Kilman in the Army and Navy stores. Where Hugh, as Peter observes, might eat cake with a duchess any day of his life, and to look at him probably did spend a good deal of time in that agreeable occupation. Miss Kilman has been denied her share of the sugared cake of English post-war posterity. A casualty of English nationalist bigotry, Miss Kilman is degradingly poor. Her career absolutely ruined after she's dismissed from Miss Dolby's school for her pro-German sympathies. As Christine Fraule has pointed out, the novel registers in Kilman's character a deep reckoning with Bloomsbury arguments about the perils of the economic terms of the peace imposed upon Germany. Clarissa recognizes that her own hatred for her daughter's tutor far exceeds the actual person, for it was not her one hated, but the idea of her, which undoubtedly had gathered into itself a great deal that was not Miss Kilman. By contrast, Richard's compassion for the private plight of Miss Kilman, a pacifist Quaker with internationalist sympathies, and a knowledge of modern history that was thorough in the extreme, reflects the prescient warnings of Clive Bell's Peace at Once and John Maynard Keynes's The Economic Consequences of the Peace, that the Allied demand for punitive reparations against Germany was an economic policy bound to foment nationalist aggression and increase the likelihood of another war. Thus, with hot and turbulent feelings which boiled and surged in her, Miss Kilman lurches clumsily like an unwieldy battleship through the confused accumulation of commercial goods in the Army and Navy stores, threatening to detonate at the slightest provocation. With all this luxury going on, what hope was there for a better state of things, she quips. For as Lady Bruton's emigration scheme makes clear, it is an uneven post-war economy, booming disproportionately for some more than others. The intense corporeality of Miss Kilman and her appetites epitomizes the repulsive physicality that Septimus attributes to human nature in its most bestial form, inhering in the sordidity of the mouth and the belly, and also evokes the Teutonic spirit and symbolism Woolf witnessed on a pre-war trip to Bayreuth with Adrian and Saxon Sidney Turner to hear Wagner. Her letters to Vanessa depict the German townspeople in disgusted and dehumanizing terms as monster men and women, incredibly stout and garish, who eat enormously off great joints covered in fat. And she observes, I haven't seen one German woman who has a face. They are all puddings of red dough. Among the many indignities she suffers, Miss Kilman saw herself thus lurching with her hat askew, very red in the face, full length in a looking glass, as if one of the Bayreuth women suddenly apprehending her own caricature. Miss Kilman's desire for Elizabeth translates into a private erotic idiom, the gluttonous appetite circulating in the European cultural imagination. If she could grasp her, if she could clasp her, if she could make her hers absolutely and forever and then die, that was all she wanted. Miss Kilman's appropriative infatuation with Elizabeth, desiring to consume its object absolutely and forever, suggests too, in all that grasping and clasping, a kind of rapacious territorial conquest that had characterized the first arguably global war, and what Fraule has aptly dubbed the that followed it. The far from neutral setting of the Army and Navy stores is more than just a site of consumptive frivolity. The lucrative outlet for military surplus, newly opened to the general public in 1918, suggests the war's continuing profitability and the state of perpetual military readiness that would tip the post-war cultural imaginary that the war was over, thank heaven over, into its interwar eventuality. Clarissa's solemn premonition that something awful was about to happen, sounding the anxiety of the future conditional voice that Paul Saint-Amour has shown haunts the novel. As the radical pacifist, feminist, queer, foreign, kill man and kill joy of the Army and Navy store's tea room, and its sugary atmospherics of post-war decadence, Elizabeth's tutor aspires to master the flesh and convert London's upper-class heathen. Though Miss Kilman opts for a plain petticoat, however, she fixes her eyes upon a plate of cakes, which flaunt a luxury that was strictly rationed during wartime. But when a child at a neighboring table takes the one she has been eyeing, could Miss Kilman really mind it, the narrator asks. Yes, Miss Kilman did mind it. She had wanted that cake, the pink one. The pleasure of eating was almost the only pure pleasure left her, and then to be baffled even in that. Military, commercial, and erotic consumption are baked into Miss Kilman's queer pink cake, recalling the pink gauze that Sally Seton wears when she rapturously kisses Clarissa on the lips. Notwithstanding the alarmingly possessive nature of Miss Kilman's desire for Elizabeth, what is perhaps most striking here is that her illusion about the purity of such appetites and its pleasures. The flip side of her desire to master or overmaster Clarissa and the privileged classes is Miss Kilman's presumed moral exemption, her imagined position of innocence with respect to the suffering of others, whether human or non-human. And the narrator's passing comparison of Elizabeth to a horse longing to bolt, a dumb creature galloping in terror to the end of the field, gives the lie to Miss Kilman's martyred cross-species beneficence. In Woolf's arch delivery, Miss Kilman's seemingly innocuous desire for a department store baked good is no exercise in abstinence, but an obscene orgasmic tort with cannibalistic sprinkles. The narrator offers us a revolting close-up of Miss Kilman devouring her confection as she opened her mouth, slightly projected her chin, and swallowed down the last inches of the chocolate eclair that she had been preciously and masturbatorily fingering moments earlier. She lingers over her eclair, much like Hugh's leisurely pace with the chicken casserole, reluctant to let her pupil go, pleading, "I haven't quite finished yet." But Miss Kilman cannot have her decadent layered Elizabeth cake and eat her too. In a cannibalistic variation on the figurative web that connects Lady Bruton to her luncheon guests as they travel across London, Miss Kilman feels Elizabeth as she went, drawing out the very entrails in her body, stretching them as she crossed the room. The warp speed metabolism implied in Woolf's syntax here has Miss Kilman polishing off the last chocolatey morsel of her pupil, which, in this excruciating metaphor, passes en route through Miss Kilman's entrails as they're extruded from her body. I think about Zizek's capitalist notion of the chocolate laxative, like you're free to enjoy, but then evacuate. If we're webbed to those with whom we lunch, we're also bizarrely disemboweled by those we eat. And so the novel's queer carnal intimacy stuffs Lady Bruton's light gossamer metaphor into the guts of its envious underclass. Recent developments in meat production, including real fake meats, raise similar questions about our taste for dominion. Even as it promises more environmentally sustainable and ethically responsible practices, such impossible foods insist upon their resemblance in texture, appearance, and flavor to animal flesh. This representational duplicity has provoked heated legal debates over the commercial deployment of the word meat and prompted anxious efforts by cattle lobbyists to ban the word meat from products that do not contain animal flesh. Thickening the moral quandary raised by meat substitutes, Banu Subramaniam evinces a pattern by which technology, ever inventive and agile, evades such dilemmas by proposing techno-scientific solutions to ethical problems as we currently frame them. As industrialized agriculture takes a more centralized role in food production, the technosciences emerge to offer up ever more ingenious answers to our anemic craving for animal flesh. The recent explosion in real fake meat, less realistic meat products with their facsimiles of beef, pork, chicken, offers the prospect of meat without killing, the production of more ecologically clean, pain-free or victimless meat, what Mark Bittman has dubbed, not without irony, chicken without guilt. Plant-made animal meats provide fertile ground for thinking about what Angela Wiley calls the post-moral ethics of consumption, where pleasure and harm matter simultaneously. Such a post-moral ethics refuse unfair choices between abstinence and gluttonous abandon, say between starving oneself for the Austrians or fattening oneself on the blood of others, and ask that, in Wiley's words, we own our complicity with violence without either moralizing or letting ourselves off the hook. It is the mark of Woolfian decadence to hold these competing values in suspension, however difficult we may find it to chew. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicki. That was amazing. I'm just, yeah, there's too much to choose from at the moment. So we're going to take 2 minutes to compose ourselves, think about eclairs, and we'll be back at 10:08. So just give it 2 minutes for what I'm hoping will be a very lively Q&A. Thank you so much for 3 great papers, y'all. Okay. As we all come back and get started for the Q&A, I'll just remind everybody that if you have a question that you want to ask, you can put it in the chat. You can just ask it, or you can raise your hand with the reaction button down at the bottom of your screen there, and we'll call on you. I'm very excited to have this. My facial expression's great. Well, I am your hostess after all, so I'm here to make sure to charm, delight, and make sure everybody has a good discussion. So here we go. Does anybody have a question for any of our panelists? I'd like to get us started off. Christina, please.
I don't know how fully formulated this is, but so I was trying to think about across some of the different papers and the idea of the hostess and hospitality, and the way in which, say, Lady Bruton is represented in comparison to the way in which Clarissa Dalloway or Mrs. Ramsey are represented. And so, and then I was trying to think about how the food that they serve is kind of coded and so on. So I guess I guess one question would be sort of Mrs. Ramsay and the beef dish into the lighthouse as compared to Lady Bruton's lunch, or to what extent is the food associated with the hostess? I don't know, sort of a food and hostess intersection around beef, something along those lines. If anyone would like to jump in on that.
Yeah, that's great, Christina. Thanks. I mean, thinking about, I mean, I'm sure that boof dish, is delicious, but it's like the closing meal right before the First World War. And, she sort of looks to Andrew and Prue to kind of carry things on. And they're both, sort of killed off in the time passes section, Andrew to the war and Prue to, her mother's expectations of marriage and childbearing. So there's a sense in which maybe she sort of unwittingly or wittingly is kind of serving up. And even some of the sacrificial metaphors that sort of, imaginatively taking individuals to the altar. It's like a sacrificial altar and a marriage altar. So, I mean, there's something Lady Bruton-like about Mrs. Ramsay as well.
That just makes me think of at the beginning of the third section, the question of what do you take or what do you send to the lighthouse, and like, I don't know if I'm supposed to make sandwiches, or I don't know. yeah.
Yeah. And that seems like the impromptu nature of that. And, I don't know, perhaps those sandwiches could be vegan. There are other options that seem a little bit more creative and less choreographed, and maybe, with less dangerous designs on them in those sandwiches. And I was thinking too of Christopher, your sense of the kind of dangers involved in pleasure from an entirely different perspective. I mean, obviously I've been sort of sunk in meat, but thinking about the pandemic too is also sort of informing our sense of the pleasures we're seeking being potentially fatal. And even if not for ourselves, for others. Like I think about all those occasions in which perhaps I shouldn't go because I might be unwittingly bearing COVID to somebody who has greater health risks than I do. So, I mean, there are real ethics at stake in all of those sorts of, I think you used the word like the municipal aspects of pleasure, which is so great.
Christopher, do you want to respond to Vicki at all? And then Amy's got a question.
I think I'm still reeling from the phrase warp speed metabolism. I love that. And the imagery of an eclair. I wrote that down. Yeah. I while I was listening to your presentation, Vicki, which was so rich with detail, I had never actually put the idea of rationing as a backdrop to decadence, which I think is so fascinating. I read a line someone had written. It could have been Wikipedia or some article saying that, Woolf is fundamentally a wartime writer, or that this is a backdrop to most of her work, but rationing is an aspect I hadn't really put there. And I guess Woolf doesn't really talk about rationing too, obviously, but I think some of these things, I really want to go back and reread, specifically Mrs. Dalloway, with this idea of rationing in mind, and see how the novel plays out with that in mind.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and also I've just read Jessica Martel's book, which is about sort of, farm and food matters in modernist literature. And she sort of returns to Woolf's war diaries and, and sort of experience of rationing culture and things. And, Woolf is probably mining that in Mrs. Dalloway. So, so that sort of brought to mind those connections for me.
Amy. Oh, Stella. Amy, then Stella? Oh.
I'd rather hear from Stella than hear from myself.
We always want to hear from you, but okay. Stella, go ahead.
Well, my question, I think, does perhaps follow up a little bit with what we've been talking about. First of all, those were such splendid papers, and there's something so wonderful about having 3 different papers on a single novel that we all know that, there's just so much to talk about. I am wondering if to put together Jean's Shannon's. I'm sorry. Can you
Jiangnan.
help me?
Jiangnan.
Thank you. Shonan, thank you. Put together Shonen's and Vicky's paper. I'm wondering if we can think a little bit about what happens after the meal, what happens after the buffon d'aube. So, you know, in the terms of Jeannan's paper, is there a moment when Mrs. Dalloway, the hostess, is superseded? And I'm thinking about, and likewise, is there an aftermath to the buffon d'aube as a kind of, you know, sacrificial meal? And I'm thinking just about that moment in the novel, which is so important and so beautiful, where, but, you know, not without sort of questions raised, but where Mrs. Dalloway looks around at the party and sees it as a party rather than her being sort of a hostess, sees it as a community, right? And she thinks about the way in which the panes of glass seem to sort of safely enclose everyone. And she thinks, we will come back to this. This is something that we've all shared. This is communal. And she doesn't seem like a hostess there. She seems to have been able to get beyond that. And also it does follow the buffon d'aube. So I'm just wondering how that might fit in with these two papers.
It also remind me that also Mr. Ramsey, she lading the soup for every guest at the party. I think maybe sharing a food is really a kind of the way that people eat one thing together to make them feel the community. But I think also one thing very interesting that, for example, the beef Mr. Ramsey cooked, she was proud of the beef and she said it's a recipe from her grandma or someone. But the beef is actually made by her maid, I think. So I think also there's some nuance in her, what she said and the who cooked the meal, the food, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking too about, I mean, Clarissa does, I didn't get this far in my paper today, but Clarissa does serve, you know, food to her guests, and I think it's salmon. And Anne, I was just thinking about your paper yesterday, and Lady Bradshaw in Happier Moments like caught wild salmon herself. And then Clarissa like serves it up to her guests, but doesn't prepare it herself. I wonder, I don't know, there's some like kind of compromised female pleasure agency that seems to be on the plate there. Of course, I can't help, you know, but find all of the sort of sadness or overripe bits and, you know, in these delicious dishes. But I think there is a way in which the meat kind of circulates around the characters in these novels and is kind of more than itself, and asks us to kind of raise these questions about who it's bringing together and you know, what might be served or sacrificed in those dishes.
That from that perspective, Vicki, the moment where you talk about the table that spreads itself, and that implicit, you know, right after that, following with the analogy of the men served up, right, as soldiers, fodder for the war, was particularly moving, compelling. So Amy, and then Jean, and then Leanna and Anne. So go ahead, Amy.
I was wondering about, I had a collection of questions for Jenna. When you were talking about hospitality, I always think, so I write about Greek mythology, so I was thinking about the Greek concept of hospitality, which is a religious concept and a social concept. And they have very clear, explicit hospitality rules in ancient Greece. And it seems like that's probably influenced Western conceptions of hospitality, which are then critiqued and thought about and stuff. And I was wondering if you have a sense of sort of differences between that kind of Greek influenced Western conception of hospitality and other cultural conceptions of hospitality that you might find helpful, or that you do find helpful in kind of disrupting or asking questions about the ways that Western literature thinks about hospitality. I don't know if that question makes a lot of sense, if that question's working for you. I can rework it if you want me to.
I've read some books about the kind of the Greek. I'm not sure it's the Greek hospitality. It's about a kind of religious part about it, when the guest might be the kind of some gold or other things that maybe we should respect them, to respect to a stranger, because we might know that they are the kind of something superior than us. And also when the hospitality changed to nowadays, maybe because it's hard for me to think about the word in English, but in the nowadays, when we have wars, and the hospitality might have the opposite ideas about maybe the people will, when you invite a guest in your home, they might take over your position, and they might be dangerous. I think they got the tension between the past understanding about it and the nowadays. But I think it's picky here. But first, I choose to want to show the great aspect of them as a whole. So I choose to say that they might be a kind of great host and guest relation. But you're right, they got attention there. Yeah, they need more exploration.
Well, I thought I really liked your it seems Shilo was also thinking about the Greeks. I really loved your paper, and I love and I know Shilo did too. She sent me a text saying how much she loved the paper as you were reading it. And I would love to see you develop it more, and thinking about, I guess I was kind of thinking, since the cultural tradition in which you got your education, in which you grew up, is not probably terribly influenced by Greek assumptions, sort of things derived from Greek. And I'm really interested in the way that the contribution that other cultural conceptions of all kinds of things, but ethical concepts in particular, and here hospitality, and it's such a kind of, for the Greeks, hospitality was this incredibly central virtue, religious concept that governed so many aspects of life, and therefore of literary production. And it's very interesting to me about other ways that people have thought about those relationships across the world, across time. So yeah, I really enjoyed your contribution.
Jeannie.
Thank you. Wow, this was such a great panel. I was just hanging on to every word. Quick question for Christopher. Christopher, we know that Woolf I don't know when she read Freud, but I think it was later in life and after Mrs. Dalloway. But boy, it's just really hard not to think about his we have sort of two motives. We can either live life seeking pleasure or avoiding pain. And so I just wonder if those ideas were also floating around the air at the time that Woolf wrote Mrs. Dalloway, because I was just so moved by your paper. But if if that was the case, I mean, again, maybe it's so obvious. I don't know, it's so obvious, but do you know if that was kind of in the air, or if she just anticipates him, or I don't know.
No, I think that's a really great question. And for some reason, I don't know why, I don't ever put Woolf and Freud together in my mind, but I know that, the Bloomsbury group had a lot to do with translating Freud into English. But the idea of the death drive and kind of the drive to live, I do see that kind of play out perhaps with Septimus and Clarissa in a kind of unfortunate, fatal way. That Septimus really is kind of driven to this, fatal end, and Clarissa is kind of the opposite side. So maybe Woolf's picking up on that somewhat, and splitting that drive across those two characters in a way. That's a really fascinating question. I should probably spend more time actually putting Freud and Woolf together in my mind, because I think it does fill the air at the time, the atmosphere, the imaginations probably, but it's not. I don't think it's someone that Woolf goes to and writes about. But I know that she definitely may have picked up on some of these ideas just through conversation, probably.
Leanna, you had your hand up, and then Anne.
Yeah, I was trying to type something out in case we run out of time, but I just listening to all these wonderful papers, thank you all. I kind of struck about thinking, I guess a question rose to my mind of like, what are the ethics of like hosting a party in a like post-pandemic world? Like, I feel like that kind of maybe connects like all three of them. I just know like from personal experience, I had to like cancel my wedding twice. And like, so it's like really hard to like make those decisions, but then you're weighing like, is this good for people to come together versus like, is this bad for people to come together? Could people get sick? Like, I don't know if it's like a very good question, but that was something that kind of made me think of.
Christopher, I don't know if this is striking you, but in your reading, bringing up those moments about, I totally forgotten that Ellie Henderson sort of registers the danger to her person. And, you know, we see that like she knows that Clarissa wasn't really going to invite her. So the kind of power of a host or hostess to be inclusive and exclusive in that moment. But Ellie sort of shows us, you know, in a wonderful way that the dangers of that gathering and registers that and kind of is a voice of, you know, a kind of embedded and maybe repressed concern within Clarissa. So she sort of extends the communication there. But I thought that the Ellie character, I mean, that was a great, you know, a great inclusion in your reading. And I'd love to sort of hear more about.
Yeah, Ellie, I really like that character of Ellie. And she takes up a lot when you read it through that perspective, she takes up a lot more of the party than I remember when I first read this novel, partly because I think I was presented the novel as, here's a modern novel, let's read it with gender in mind. So those moments really fell into the background. But I think the question of, is this something that should be done in a pandemic space? I think that if you knowing what we know about how CO2 levels in rooms and keeping distance and keeping fresh air in, if you read the novel in mind with this knowledge that we have about how to mitigate illness, the fact that the doors are coming off, Clarissa goes outside immediately, she wants to plunge outside, Ellie's sitting by an open window. I think that it's kind of unspoken that all of these things have been put in place by the hostess, making these efforts to almost make it quite safe. But then she's still a bit like, oh, damn, people are coming here talking about sickness. This is probably the thing I didn't really want to happen, but it's happening. And we shift in a very Woolfian way to this marginalized character, Ellie, who is a bit like, am I going to get sick? For me, I don't think it matters at this moment in time, because she's just happy to, I think, be invited. But I think even the fact she's like, should I be here, is probably an aspect of, luckily the chills don't go to my heart, so I think I'm all right to look at this stuff. So I've taken that kind of like, that risk is mine to take. But I think it's a really interesting ethic to think about, how much are we willing to risk for the sake of what kind of pleasure?
I think one of the terms you used might have been susceptibility in your paper, and I thought the idea of there's something so steady about Ellie at that moment that they never go to her chest, but the other guests somehow seem more vulnerable, more susceptible. And so I think that actually maybe moves us into Anne's question about the waves and the way that illness moves bodies. But I don't know if that's, you're just putting that in the chat and you have a different question, but Anne, yeah.
I can just
kind of a comment.
Sorry, one last quick thing about Leanna's question in relation to Ellie, Christopher, is thinking about that open window, right? Like the curtain blows out and at some point one of the guests like beats it back or something. And somehow like for Clarissa's mind, like the party starts at that moment. It's not that people close the window, they keep it open so that there's fresh air ventilating, but it's kind of blowing in the ghost of the anxiety of pandemic culture. And the fact that he just, like takes a cane or something something and like beats the curtain back. It's like, bah, we're going to put the pandemic behind us, gosh darn it, and let's party and let's not worry about, you know, the flu pandemic.
Yeah.
And so, you know, they all at that moment kind of collectively agree, we're all just going to take the risk. We're going to hope that we've all been safe and our COVID test kits before we came. And so that kind of begins the party, and that we're registering this through Ellie. There's a lot there. Okay, I'm done.
And so I want to hear Anne's question, and I know we have Christina and a couple questions in the chat. I'm okay with going a few minutes over because we have a nice break before the next panel, but I also wanted to mark that we are at time. So for those of you, maybe a brief show of hands for those of you who are willing to stay and talk a bit more. Okay, great. All right, I'm in. Yeah, let's do this all day. Okay, go ahead, Anne. Party time. There we go.
No, it's just that kind of comment about silencing and that the centrality of the hostess and yet her marginality at the same time. And there are so many ways in which that spectacle of inscrutability, Christopher, that you quoted, it's like we're being misdirected narratively. So here's the figure that you're supposed to focus on, and yet think about this. And I think that's how trauma is being. So when Ellie Henderson is talking, you've got this spectacle of the pandemic. I was thinking also about Ellie Henderson nursing her father, who's now dead, and how that, not just to the pandemic, but also, Vicki, to the war, where you're talking about the servants dressed like nurses. What kind of labor isn't being on the radar, and yet it's being evoked through this clustering of images? So that the spectacle of inscrutability, that's how Wolf to my eyes has been working. Like lately, I've been perceiving that more and more. So more of a comment than a question, but what a great panel this has been.
I had forgotten that about Ellie. Thank you for reminding me. I'd forgotten that about Ellie. Something about the party as well. It's almost like imagining it. Wolf does this really great thing for my mind where it's like montage or collaging, and so we move through these different. You've got this room and this room, and then sometimes it's almost like watching a play that's actually changing scenes, and we keep going back to Ellie. So we have all these different. It is like a spectacle of, and you're kind of, you know, like what's the focus here, and then you receive those flashes of detail, which, you know, Ellie Henderson's father has recently died. And I think she has nursed him or something like that, or she's, and again, it's kind of like this party for her represents something that is a bit inscrutable, or we're not really privy to it. But Wolf kind of shows us she's a great, you know, I think she's a good master of show and don't tell. So it's kind of like she's come to this party, and we received some register of what this means to her. And on one level, it could be this is a distraction. So that's why she's risking going there even if she's a little bit nervous about getting sick, by sitting by the open window, which is obviously not at the center of the party.
Christina.
Yeah, so just following on from what Anne was saying, it suddenly occurred to me the idea of the hostess partly being tied up with sort of seeming not to do anything, like everything has to be effortless, it has to appear to just happen, and yet there's so much kind of work, and as you were saying, the work of the servants and so on, but like the sign of the success of a party is that it looks like it just fell together and so on. So that was just something. But the question that I had, it's that thing of the delayed hand thing. So the question that I had originally put the hand up for was I was just wondering, like, what the sort of recommendations about gatherings and isolation and so on were like during the Spanish flu outbreak, and I realized I have that viral modernism book sitting on my shelf, and to my shame I haven't read it yet. But yeah, so both those are two completely different questions. But yeah, if anyone had thoughts on either of them.
I know from when I was reading around what kind of it's very similar actually advice, apart from masks. It was kind of a bit like you probably might want to wash your hands a lot more and have a lot more fresh air in a room. Quite similar, but I think a little bit more straightforward.
Peter, if you're still here, I wanted to sort of pick up on your question about long COVID. And yeah, could you say some about that?
Yeah, I suppose I was thinking specifically about the anecdotal, experiential, and also the sort of scientific literature that it now exists around a sort of ongoingness. I guess there's a sense in which we've got a better understanding of like post-viral conditions, and whether this offers us. When I was listening to your paper, Christopher, I was thinking about the different, maybe it's not right to say Septimus's illness is more intense, but it's a different kind of intensity to the illness that Clarissa is experiencing, and whether there's a way of understanding illness within that distinction, and maybe connecting that to the sort of social aspects of the novel. I'm aware that's a lot. This is just me sort of thoughts off the top of my head, but this sort of way in which how we behave socially is also linked to how we feel. And as someone who had long COVID, I can say for a long time, I didn't want to go to any parties. I just wanted to lie on my couch and watch Netflix. And yeah, so the party at the end of Mrs. Dalloway seems all the more remarkable for that.
If I could just add on to Peter's comments, and your comment, Peter, made me really think about something, well, reminds me of the moment in Christopher's paper where you just helped me reconsider all of a sudden the lark, the plunge, which had always read to me as a sort of, it seemed a bit odd. It seemed like about just getting out of the household, right? But so it seemed sort of gendered. But when you add in the force of a protracted illness, this sort of exhilaration of being out again, a plunge is also dangerous. And I've experienced that also myself, right? And sort of what is it like to be outside again, or that the dangers inherent of being with others, where sometimes even something like your closest loved ones, being near them feels like danger, love feels like danger. So from that perspective, the lark and the plunge, you just in that very moment just changed the way that I read that particular section. So thank you. And I was wondering if it also sort of accounts for that triumph that was just pointed out too, is it's that combination of a kind of sustained fragility and sort of maybe perhaps conquering that sense of illness, vulnerability, in a daring way for Clarissa anyway. Yeah, thank you both. I don't know if you wanted to say anything else about that, but.
No, I do. I think it's really, I think that's, thank you both for saying those things. I think it's just really great to hear responses that come out that way. I do think that in terms of mapping long COVID onto a novel like this does it brings certain things into relief, such as the fact that we don't really know how long Clarissa has spent indoors. There are some suggestions to this room. It's almost like she's just deliberately, well, not deliberately, but has been encouraged by everyone around her to repress this experience. But she's kind of like, well, no, this is, I want to do this party, and to juxtapose that with Septimus. I think Septimus isn't really bothered really necessarily about actually anymore. He's been driven down from, he's decided it doesn't matter if anyone understands me or not, whereas Clarissa's desperate to be understood. She wants these experiences to be understood, and I think the party is a spectacle of that, like a representation of actually let's bring people together. It doesn't necessarily matter if they know why we're doing it. If they do, then that's fantastic. But I do think that there is some aspect of the fact that Clarissa doesn't want to forget, or she wants to at least convert this experience of having had this illness into something a little bit more worthwhile that people can understand and share in, which is more pleasurable, I think, for her. So I think that someone mentioned, maybe it was Christina, about all of the effort that's, this effort is invisible. That's really, I think, a really helpful way of thinking about the actual party itself as well. It's a spectacle that doesn't really want to look like a spectacle, kind of like a virus as well. It's, Elizabeth Alker says that in the book, that Wolf almost uses consciousness as a way to emulate a virus, the way a virus moves through a population. So I do think the invisibility of the effort of the party is something that Clarissa deals with quite silently and privately.
And that doesn't even get us into sort of the difference that, well, the similarities or the way that one can think about it, a sustained and chronic illness in relation to what Septimus endures, suffers, and experiences. I wish that we had so much more time. I have questions about Montaigne and actually wanting to bring on being ill into the conversation as well. But for now, I just want to say thank you so much for 3 really incredible papers. And I'm so glad to have spent this time with you today, and see you in the rest of the conference.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all for such great questions as well.
Thanks, everyone.